There was a time when the words "Brazil is coming" made grown men shiver. Coaches lost sleep. Defenders rehearsed nightmares. Entire nations lowered their expectations the second the yellow shirt walked onto the pitch. That fear wasn't hype. It was earned decade after decade by a country that turned football into something closer to religion than sport. And if you're watching this channel, you already sense what's happening now. You've watched the recent games. You've seen the qualifying table. You've felt that weird silence when Brazil takes the field and nobody flinches anymore. This video is going to walk you through exactly how the most feared footballing nation on earth stopped being scary, using the actual matches, the actual numbers, and the actual moments where the wheels came off. Not opinions, not vibes, a timeline. And by the end, you're going to understand something most fans still refuse to admit out loud. This isn't a slump. This is a collapse in slow motion, and it started earlier than you think. Stick with me, because the moment it truly broke is not the one everybody points to. Let's rewind. For most of the 20th century, Brazil was not simply a country that played football well. Brazil was the country that defined what football could look like when it was played by people who treated the ball like an extension of their body. 5 World Cups, the most of any nation on the planet, sitting inside a trophy case that used to feel less like a display and more like a warning label to the rest of the world. And every generation of Brazilians grew up understanding a very specific promise. If you were talented enough, disciplined enough, hungry enough, you would one day wear that shirt, and when you did, opponents would fear you before you even touched the grass. That was the deal. That was the identity. Now think about the last time a defender looked genuinely scared to line up against a Brazilian attacker. Think hard, because if the honest answer is somewhere back in the early 2010s, you've already stumbled onto the thesis of this video. To understand how far Brazil has fallen, you first have to understand how impossibly high they once stood. And that story doesn't begin in a stadium. It begins in the dirt streets and back alleys of neighborhoods where football wasn't sport. It was survival, expression, and status all at once. In the early 1900s, the game arrived in Brazil the same way it arrived in most of South America. Through European sailors, businessmen, and elite clubs that treated the sport like a private country club activity. Clean pitches, fixed positions, formal tactics, almost bourgeois in its rigidity. Football was, for first generation, a game for the privileged, and specifically for white, upper-class Brazilians of European descent who could afford to play as amateurs with no financial pressure whatsoever. But outside those manicured fields, a completely different game was being born. In the alleys, on the beaches, in empty lots strewn with broken glass and rocks. In neighborhoods where the poorest working-class Brazilians, most of them of African or indigenous descent, were forbidden from joining the elite clubs, and so they invented their own version of the sport. No proper goals, no proper ball, no proper space, just improvisation, tight quarters, and the constant need to solve impossible situations with the outside of your foot or the top of your head. And that limitation, that pure lack of space and resources, is exactly what forged the DNA of the football that would eventually terrify the planet. Because when you learn to dribble in a 2-meter alley, open space feels like a runway. When you learn to keep the ball glued to your foot with kids twice your size trying to kick it out of you, professional defenders feel slow. When you spend your childhood turning constraints into art, you eventually walk onto a proper pitch and start doing things nobody thought were physically possible. That's not a coincidence. That's a cultural machine producing a specific kind of footballer over and over again for decades. And the machine ran without interruption, quietly humming in every favela and every dirt lot, long before the world had a name for what it was building. That machine had a soundtrack too, a rhythm. And to understand why Brazilian football scared people for so long, you have to understand where that rhythm came from. The style that came out of those alleys wasn't random. It carried the fingerprint of the culture around it. When you look at classic Brazilian dribbling, that low center of gravity, that hypnotic hip shift, that way of feinting with the shoulders before the feet ever move, you are not watching pure football. You are watching samba, the national dance, the rhythm that plays in every corner of Brazilian life, from carnival to backyard parties to funerals. That same rhythm is the reason a Brazilian midfielder in 1970 could beat 3 defenders without ever accelerating. Not because he was faster, because he was on a beat the other players couldn't hear. And then there's the other invisible ingredient, capoeira. Brazil's own martial art disguised as a dance, born from enslaved Africans who were forbidden from practicing combat, and so they hid the training inside music and choreography. Every bicycle kick, every over-the-head flick, Every ridiculous scissor movement you've ever seen a Brazilian player pull off in a highlight reel, all of it borrows something from capoeira. The upside-down balance, the trust in your body doing things that shouldn't work, the refusal to accept that gravity has the final say. When a Brazilian player in the 50s bicycle kicked a goal, it wasn't a stunt. It was a cultural reflex. His body already knew how to invert itself. So put those two ingredients together, samba rhythm and capoeira body control, and add them to a nationwide obsession with the ball that starts in the crib. You get a country that is essentially manufacturing footballers the way other countries manufacture engineers. Except nobody in Brazil is doing it on purpose. It's happening in the background of daily life. Kids are training 30 hours a week without realizing they are training. By the time a Brazilian teenager walks into his first serious tryout, he has already spent 10,000 hours learning to solve football problems the rest of the world will never even face on their pitches. And then in 1958, that machine spit out its first perfect product. A skinny 17-year-old kid from a poor neighborhood in the interior of Sao Paulo, whose father had been a modest player himself, and whose family barely had money to feed him properly. His full name was Edson Arantes do Nascimento. But the world was about to know him as Pelé. And what Pelé did in that 1958 World Cup in Sweden is one of those moments in sports history where you can genuinely divide the sport into before and after. Because Pelé wasn't just a great player. Pelé was the visual proof, delivered on a global stage for the first time, that everything Brazil had been quietly cooking up in its alleys and beaches for 50 years was real. He walked into a tournament dominated by tall, structured European sides that played rigid, disciplined, positional football. He was smaller than everyone, younger than everyone, poorer than everyone, and he outplayed all of them. He scored a hat-trick in the semi-final against France. He scored 2 more in the final against Sweden, with the Swedish crowd watching a Brazilian teenager humiliate their team on their own soil. And when the whistle blew, Brazil had their first World Cup, and world football had a completely new template for what a great player looked like. But Pelé wasn't alone. That team was stacked. Garrincha, the winger with the crooked legs who somehow became one of the most unstoppable dribblers of all time. Vava, the ruthless finisher. Didi, the midfield general. That squad, and the ones that followed it in 1962, and especially the mythical 1970 side, would go on to win 3 World Cups in 12 years. 3 out of 4 possible tournaments. Absolute domination. And all of it, and this is the part that matters for our story, all of it built with Brazilian players who had been developed inside Brazil, who played their club football inside Brazil, who represented the Brazilian league every single week. That's important. Hold on to that detail. Because a huge part of what made Brazil terrifying in that era wasn't just the individual quality. It was the fact that these players had grown up together, played against each other for years in the same domestic league, and arrived at the national team with a shared language, a shared rhythm, and a shared understanding of what the Brazilian way actually meant on the pitch. They didn't need to build chemistry. They were already fluent in the same footballing dialect. And people can argue all day about whether the competition back then was as strong as today. Some folks call the opposition farmers. I used to lean that way myself. But it doesn't matter, because relative to their era, that Brazilian side wasn't just winning. They were operating on a completely different plane. They weren't playing the same sport as their opponents. And that gap, that visible, terrifying, undeniable gap, is what carved the identity of Brazilian football into stone for the next 50 years. By the time the 1980s rolled around, Pelé had already retired. The king had left the throne. And in most footballing nations, that would have been the beginning of a long identity crisis. What do you do when your greatest player, your defining symbol, walks away? Most countries never fully recover. Argentina waited an entire generation between Maradona and Messi. England is still, in some ways, waiting for a proper heir to Bobby Charlton. But Brazil just kept the machine running. Because that's what a proper football culture does. It doesn't depend on one player. It produces new ones on a conveyor belt. And out of that conveyor belt in the 70s and early 80s came a player who would be so good, so technically perfect, so aesthetically pleasing to watch, that Brazilians literally started calling him the White Pelé. His name was Zico, and around him formed one of the most beloved Brazilian squads of all time, even though, and this is the tragic part, they never actually won a World Cup. Zico was joined by Socrates, the philosopher Dr. midfielder with the beard and the headband who played the game like he was writing a novel with his feet. Junior, the elegant left back who could dribble past 3 players before delivering a cross. Eder, the striker with the thunderous left foot, and a supporting cast of technicians who made every match look like a coaching clinic. The 1982 Brazil team, in particular, is one of those sides that fans still talk about with actual grief in their voices. Because in that World Cup in Spain, Brazil played what many people, and I don't say this lightly, what many people still describe as the most beautiful football ever seen at a World Cup. Free-flowing, ridiculous passing sequences, goals that came from nowhere, long-range strikes that bent physics. And then, in one of the cruelest quarterfinal defeats in football history, they lost to Italy in a game they should have drawn to advance. Paolo Rossi scored a hat-trick. Brazil went home, and an entire generation of Brazilians walked around in mourning because they knew what they had just lost. They had watched perfection get eliminated by pragmatism. Now here's the thing that matters for our story. That defeat didn't shake Brazil's identity. If anything, it strengthened it. Because even in loss, that team had made a statement to the world about how Brazil played the game. They didn't win the trophy, but they won the hearts. And they cemented the belief that Brazil didn't just have to win. Brazil had to win beautifully. That obligation, that cultural pressure to play the beautiful game, would become both the biggest strength and, as we'll see later, one of the biggest problems for future generations trying to modernize. And by the way, if you're enjoying this deep dive into how one of the greatest footballing nations lost its identity, do me a quick favor and smash that like button. It genuinely helps the channel reach more football fans who care about the actual history of the sport, not just the highlights. And if you have opinions on that 1982 side, or if you think there's an even better Brazil team from that era, drop your take in the comments. I read every one. Anyway, back to the story. Because even without a World Cup trophy, Brazil in the 80s still delivered something historic. In 1989, they finally, after decades of unbelievable disappointment, lifted the Copa America. That trophy, the South American Championship, had somehow slipped through Brazil's fingers for over 40 years, despite them being the strongest team on the continent for most of that time. It was the great embarrassment. The trophy their own fans mocked them for not winning. And in 1989, they finally broke the curse, beating Uruguay in the final at home. That moment kicked off something important, because from that point forward, the psychological block was broken. Brazil didn't just have to win World Cups. They were now expected to win everything. Continental championships, friendlies, youth tournaments, everything. The bar was set impossibly high. And for a while, they were going to clear it. Because the next generation coming through the pipeline was about to be one of the most talent-packed collections of footballers ever assembled in one country. Names that would define the 90s and the early 2000s. Names that, if you're old enough to have watched them live, still give you goosebumps. And leading the charge was a compact, terrifying, cold-blooded striker from Rio de Janeiro who would score goals for fun in every league he ever touched. His name was Romário. And his story, along with the phenomenon who would eventually join him, is where the fear factor of Brazilian football hit its all-time peak. In 1994, Brazil had gone 24 years without lifting a World Cup. 24 years. To put that in perspective, an entire generation of Brazilian kids had grown up never seeing their country win the biggest trophy in the sport. For a country that considered itself the spiritual home of football, that drought was closer to a national wound than a sporting inconvenience. Every 4 years, they showed up as favorites. Every 4 years, something went wrong. In 1974, they finished fourth. In 1978, they went out undefeated in a controversial tournament in Argentina. In 1982, that mythical Zico team got knocked out by Italy. In 1986, Maradona happened. In 1990, they lost to Argentina in a game where they hit the post multiple times and Maradona threaded a single pass through their entire defense for Caniggia. So when Brazil arrived at USA 1994, the pressure was suffocating. And the man they were carrying on their shoulders was Romário. A short, stubby, incredibly arrogant striker who had spent the previous years terrorizing La Liga at Barcelona. Romário was not a beautiful player in the classic sense. He wasn't Zico. He wasn't Socrates. He didn't do rainbow flicks or paint the sky with long balls. Romário was something more terrifying. He was efficient, ruthless, perfectly economical. He would touch the ball twice inside the box and score, then walk back to the halfway line like he'd done the bare minimum. Paired with Bebeto, that partnership at USA 94 dragged Brazil, sometimes almost single-handedly, all the way to the final. And in that final, against a Roberto Baggio-led Italy, in a game that ended 0-0 and went to penalties, Brazil won their fourth World Cup. And Romário himself later admitted that team wasn't actually as talented as previous Brazilian sides. He said they made up for it with unity and a brutal attacking partnership, which is fascinating because it hints at something we'll come back to at the end. Sometimes the greatest Brazilian teams weren't the most stacked. They were the most connected. But if Romário was the answer to the drought, the next name coming through the pipeline was the answer to a question nobody had thought to ask yet. What if you took every physical gift a striker could possibly have, combined them with Brazilian technique, and put them in one 17-year-old body? That body belonged to Ronaldo Nazario, the phenomenon. And to this day, ask any older Brazilian fan, ask any 90s football devotee who was the most terrifying striker they ever saw in their prime, and the answer is almost always the same word: Ronaldo. Because Ronaldo before the knee injuries was, and I need you to hear this clearly, unplayable. Not just fast, not just skillful, both at the same time, at a level that had never really existed before. He could pick up the ball at the halfway line, dribble past 4 defenders in full sprint, and finish with the outside of his boot. Central defenders across Europe had panic attacks about facing him. He won the Ballon d'Or at 21. He was already the best player in the world before his body had even finished developing. And he was Brazilian, which meant in the late 90s, Brazil didn't just have a great national team. They had the single most feared attacker on the planet, and he was theirs. Paired with Rivaldo, Roberto Carlos, Cafu, Denilson, and eventually Ronaldinho, Brazil in the late 90s was a nightmare. They won the 1997 Copa America. They won the 1997 Confederations Cup. They walked into the 1998 World Cup in France as the overwhelming favorites. Everybody, and I mean everybody, expected them to lift back-to-back trophies. And then, in one of the strangest World Cup finals ever played, France beat them 3-0. Ronaldo, mysteriously, had some kind of pre-match seizure or panic episode that has never been fully explained to this day. He played, but he wasn't himself. And a Zidane-inspired France walked away with their first ever World Cup on home soil. But here's the thing. That loss didn't break Brazil. It didn't even shake them, because they came back from Paris and immediately proceeded to humiliate Argentina in a 4-1 friendly, with Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, and Rivaldo tearing them apart in front of their own fans. They won the 1999 Copa America. They kept winning everything else. And by the time 2002 rolled around, they weren't just favorites again. They were angry favorites. They wanted the trophy that had been stolen from them 4 years earlier. And they were going to take it dressed in yellow, led by Ronaldo, with a haircut so bizarre it's still a punchline 20 years later. That 2002 World Cup was the last time Brazil looked untouchable. And we need to talk about exactly what happened in that tournament, because it's the crest of the wave right before the tide starts pulling back. The 2002 World Cup, held in South Korea and Japan, is one of the strangest tournaments in modern football history. Half the traditional powers went out early. France, the defending champions, got eliminated in the group stage without scoring a single goal. Argentina crashed out at the same phase. Italy, Portugal, Spain all had bizarre exits or controversial refereeing decisions. And through the chaos, one team just kept walking through everyone like the tournament was rigged in their favor. That team was Brazil. And they weren't lucky. They were, by that point, playing a version of football nobody else in the world could match. The squad was captained by Cafu, one of the greatest right-backs of all time. In goal, Marcos, calm and gigantic. In defense, Lucio and Roque Jr., physical and reliable. In midfield, Gilberto Silva and Kleberson doing the dirty work. And in attack, the famous 3RS, Ronaldo, Rivaldo, and Ronaldinho. 3 simultaneous world-class attackers, each capable of winning a match on his own. Each with a completely different style. Ronaldo the finisher, Rivaldo the technician, Ronaldinho the magician. And when the 3 of them were on the pitch at the same time, opposing coaches were essentially trying to solve 3 separate puzzles at once, in real time, while their team was already losing. Ronaldo, in particular, was on a personal mission. He had missed most of the previous 4 years with catastrophic knee injuries. 2 full ACL reconstructions. Careers ended for less. Everybody wrote him off. He came back thinner, slower on paper, but somehow Tournament Ronaldo showed up in 2002 with 8 goals in 7 games, including both in the final against Germany. It was one of the most impressive redemption arcs in World Cup history. And when he lifted that trophy, Brazil had their 5th World Cup, the most of any nation, a record that still stands today. And the fear factor was at its absolute peak. Now imagine, and this is the counterfactual that Brazilian fans still torture themselves with, imagine if Brazil had also won that 1998 final against France. That would have been 3 consecutive World Cups. 3 in a row. Something that has never been done in the history of the sport. It would have made that generation unquestionably the greatest national team dynasty ever assembled. Bigger than Pelé's teams. Bigger than any club dynasty you could name. And even without that missing trophy, Brazil in the early 2000s was operating in a category of its own. They were terrifying. And they weren't done. Because after 2002, Brazil didn't quietly enjoy the trophy. They kept collecting silverware. In the 2004 Copa America, in a final against Argentina, Brazil found themselves losing 2-1 with only minutes to go. Carlos Tevez, then a young Argentine star, actually taunted them in the middle of the match. The Argentine fans in the stadium were already celebrating. And then in stoppage time, Adriano, another emerging Brazilian striker with a left foot like a cannon, scored a thunderous equalizer that silenced the crowd and pushed the game into penalties. Brazil won on spot kicks. Argentina walked off in disbelief. 1 year later, in the 2005 Confederations Cup final, same 2 teams again. This time Brazil didn't need drama. They just handed Argentina a straight 4-1 beating, with Ronaldinho and Adriano running the show. That match, for a generation of Brazilian fans, is one of the great humiliations delivered to their biggest rival. And it wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. Brazil in that era simply owned Argentina. They owned everybody. And that dominance, that psychological hold, that sense that walking onto a pitch against Brazil was already a mental battle you were losing, that's what scary actually meant. So Brazil rolled into the 2006 World Cup in Germany as, once again, the overwhelming favorites. And squad was, on paper, absurd. Ronaldo still there. Ronaldinho, coming off 2 consecutive Ballon d'Ors. Kaká, in his absolute prime, having just won everything at Milan. Adriano, still terrifying. Roberto Carlos, still bombing forward. Cafu, still starting at right back. For Ballon d'Or winners in one squad. Nobody in the world had a team like that. And then, in the quarterfinal, they ran into France again. And Zidane, in the best individual performance of his entire international career, absolutely dismantled Brazil in a 1-0 defeat that felt closer to a 4-0. Ronaldinho was invisible. Kaká was quiet. Ronaldo was heavy. And a golden generation walked out of the tournament with nothing. That defeat, in hindsight, is where you can start to see the crack. Not the fall. Not yet. But the very first fracture in the marble. Because Brazil recovered from 1998, then dominated. Brazil recovered from 2006, then, well, that's where the story gets complicated. And that's where we're heading next. After the 2006 quarterfinal loss to France, Brazil did what Brazil always did. They dusted themselves off, called up a mix of surviving legends and hungry young talents, and immediately went back to winning things. In the 2007 Copa America, in a final against, once again, their old friends Argentina, Brazil delivered a 3-0 masterclass. Robinho was the tournament's top scorer. Dani Alves, still emerging, looked like the natural heir to Cafu at right back. Julio Baptista, Vanna Love, Ilano, all of them contributing. On the surface, it looked like the machine was healthy. Legends aging out. New guys stepping up. Business as usual. But if you look closer, and this is the part historians don't always emphasize enough, the pipeline was already starting to sputter. Because the next generation that was supposed to inherit the 3Rs never actually materialized. Robinho, who was being marketed as the next Pelé since he was 15 years old, had all the tools. The dribbling, the finishing, the showmanship, but his career never scaled to the level of hype. Adriano, the man who should have been Ronaldo's natural successor as the Brazilian Nine, spiraled off the pitch. Personal tragedies, alcohol issues, a documented mental collapse. By his late 20s, he was essentially out of top-flight football. A body still capable of anything, a mind that could no longer show up. And this is the pattern that starts repeating. Not a shortage of talent, exactly. A shortage of talent that survives. Brazilian prospects in this era started getting shipped to Europe younger and younger, often before they were emotionally ready. Culture shock, language barriers, isolation, bad agents, predatory clubs, a whole ecosystem of things that used to be filtered by Brazilian domestic football because players stayed home longer suddenly wasn't there anymore. So more raw talent was flowing into the pipeline than ever, but less of it was making it out the other end as a fully realized international star. The 2010 World Cup in South Africa is where the discomfort really started to show. Brazil, under Dunga, was a very different animal. Pragmatic, defensive-minded, built around Lucio, Maicon Kaká, and a young Luis Fabiano at striker. They played well enough in the group stage. They dispatched Chile in the round of 16. And then, in the quarterfinal against the Netherlands, they were leading 1-0 at halftime, playing beautiful football, and then everything unraveled in the second half. Wesley Sneijder scored twice. Felipe Melo got sent off for stamping on Arjen Robben. Brazil crashed out. Dunga was fired. And the country went into another round of soul-searching. But the soul-searching only got louder because right around that time, something started shifting inside Brazilian football that was almost invisible in the moment. The identity was quietly diluting. The Joga Bonito was becoming more of a marketing slogan than an actual playing philosophy. Coaches started favoring physicality over technique. Youth academies started prioritizing early results over long-term development. And the domestic league, once the beating heart of Brazilian football culture, started losing its best young players before they could even complete a full first-team season. Nike had that gorgeous marketing campaign selling Joga Bonito to the world, and the world was still buying it, but underneath the branding, the actual product was already changing shape. And then, right when the identity crisis was starting to genuinely worry people, Brazil got one more gift from the pipeline. One more generational talent to hang their hopes on. A skinny, mohawked 18-year-old from Santos who was already being called the future of Brazilian football before he had even started shaving properly. His name was Neymar. And whatever you feel about Neymar today, whatever memes have followed him around, whatever narratives have been built up about him over the years, the pure raw talent he arrived with was undeniable. He had the samba dribbling. He had the finishing. He had the charisma. He had the swagger. He had the potential to be the natural bridge from the Ronaldinho era into whatever came next. For a moment, it felt like the pipeline was going to save itself again. Just like it had after Zico. Just like it had after Ronaldo. Brazil would produce one more transcendent superstar, build a team around him, and reclaim its throne. That was the plan. That was the hope. And Neymar, in fairness, would deliver moments of genuine brilliance for over a decade. But the machinery around him, the supporting cast, the tactical infrastructure, the federation, the culture, all of it was already starting to fail him. And the first massive public sign of that failure came in July of 2014 on Brazilian soil, in front of the entire watching world, in a game that would traumatize a nation for a generation. The 2014 World Cup was supposed to be the coronation. It was on Brazilian soil for the first time since 1950. The country had spent billions on stadiums, infrastructure, and a nationwide preparation that was in many ways controversial and painful for the working class. But the emotional deal underneath all of it was simple. Brazil would host the World Cup. Brazil would win the World Cup. That was the payoff. That was the promise that justified everything. Neymar was leading the line. David Luiz and Thiago Silva anchored the defense. Fred was the striker. Fernandinho and Luiz Gustavo held the midfield. Oscar and Hulk provided width. It wasn't the 3RS. It wasn't the 1970 team. But it was, by 2014 standards, a completely respectable squad with home field advantage and a nation of 200 million people willing them forward. They squeaked past Chile on penalties. They beat Colombia in a bruising quarterfinal, in which James Rodriguez went off with tears and Neymar went off with a fractured vertebra after a horrific challenge from Juan Zuniga. Neymar was out for the rest of the tournament. Thiago Silva was also suspended for the semi-final due to yellow card accumulation. So Brazil walked into the biggest match of the decade at home against Germany without their best attacker and without their captain. And what followed is not a game. It's a trauma. Because in the space of about 18 minutes in the first half, Germany scored 5 goals against Brazil. 5. In 18 minutes. In a World Cup semi-final. On Brazilian soil. The stadium went from anxious anticipation to stunned silence to open weeping in real time. Cameras caught grown men crying. Children in yellow jerseys frozen in place, unable to process what they were seeing. The score at halftime was 5-0. And it kept going. By the end of the 90 minutes, it was 7-1. Oscar scored a consolation goal at the death that was one of the most joyless goals ever celebrated. Because everybody in that stadium and everybody watching around the world understood what had just happened. This wasn't a bad day. This was a public execution of an identity. 7-1. It became a permanent phrase. It became a meme. It became a shorthand across the football world for total, undeniable, historic humiliation. And more importantly, it became a psychological wound on Brazilian football that has, in many ways, still not healed. Because when a country whose entire footballing identity is built on being the best in the world, on being the team everybody else fears, on being the standard bearer of the beautiful game, gets dismantled 7-1 at home in a World Cup semifinal by a European side that plays the exact kind of organized, disciplined, ruthlessly efficient football that Brazil had always positioned itself as the opposite of, something breaks. Some belief system collapses. And Brazil never quite figured out what to do next. The years that followed the 7-1 were a slow, ugly identity crisis, punctuated by embarrassments that would have been unthinkable in the 90s. In the 2015 Copa America, Neymar lost his cool against Colombia, got sent off, and picked up a suspension that kept him out for the rest of the tournament. Brazil went out on penalties to Paraguay in the quarterfinals. Paraguay. Then, in the 2016 Copa America Centenario, a controversial handball goal by Peru knocked Brazil out in the group stage. That's right, the group stage. Against Peru, in a Copa America. It was the kind of exit that used to only happen to CONCACAF minnows, not to the 5-time World Cup champions. Dunga, in his second stint as manager, was fired within days. If you're still with me here, and honestly, I hope you are because we're about to get into the modern collapse in detail, this is your reminder to hit that subscribe button. Because this channel is going to keep breaking down exactly what's happening with Brazil throughout the current qualifying campaign, and things are moving fast. Rings the bell too if you want a heads up when we drop the next one. Alright, back to the story. The 2018 World Cup in Russia was supposed to be the response. New manager, new tactical identity, a more mature Neymar returning from injury, a squad with genuine depth, Coutinho in the number 10 role, Case Moreau locking down the midfield, Marcelo bombing forward on the left. It was on paper one of the most talented Brazil squads of the modern era. They got through the group stage. They beat Mexico in the round of 16. And then, in the quarterfinal, they walked into a Belgium team that was playing the best football of that golden generation's career. Kevin De Bruyne, Eden Hazard, Lukaku all firing. Brazil went down 2-0 in the first half. Reb moved a goal back through Renato Augusto in the second half. But it wasn't enough. They were out again. Another quarterfinal exit. Another disappointment. And the pattern was starting to feel less like bad luck and more like a system-wide failure. After the 2018 quarterfinal exit, Brazilian football was in a strange in-between place. Not fully collapsed. Not remotely dominant. Somewhere in a purgatory that fans didn't quite know how to describe. And the 2019 Copa America, hosted in Brazil, was supposed to be a moment of catharsis. A chance to reset. A chance to remind the world and themselves who they were supposed to be. They won it. On paper, that should have been enough. Brazil lifted the 2019 Copa America on home soil, beating Peru 3-1 in the final. Trophy, celebration, photo op, all the boxes checked. But if you actually sat down and watched that tournament, you'd notice something uncomfortable. Brazil, playing without an injured Neymar, drew 0-0 with Venezuela in the group stage. They drew 0-0 with Paraguay in the quarterfinals and only advanced through penalties. Their attacking football was labored. Their creativity, without Neymar, felt bureaucratic. Gabriel Jesus, one of the star performers, ended the final sent-off after picking up 2 yellow cards for petulance. It was a trophy, sure, but it was the least convincing Brazilian trophy in living memory. It felt more like the tournament had been theirs by default than by right. 2 years later, in the 2021 Copa America, the mask fully slipped. Brazil, once again hosting the tournament, once again favorites, fought their way through the bracket and reached the final. And in that final, at the Maracana on Brazilian soil, in front of a heavily pro-Brazil audience, they lost to Argentina. Angel Di Maria scored the only goal of the match with a delicate lob over Ederson. And Lionel Messi, 34 years old, on his umpteenth attempt, finally lifted his first international trophy. On Brazilian grass. In the temple of Brazilian football. And you could see it on the faces of the Brazilian players at the end. Not just disappointment. Something closer to resignation. As if they knew, somewhere in the back of their heads, that the psychological hold Brazil once had over Argentina was, right there, in that moment, being reversed. Argentina wasn't afraid of Brazil anymore. Argentina was the one making Brazil sweat. That moment, more than anything else in the last decade, marked the flip of the continental hierarchy. Because from 2021 onwards, Argentina hasn't looked back. They went on to win the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. They won the 2024 Copa America. They now sit atop South American football in a way that would have been unthinkable during the 3RS era. And Brazil, the team that used to hand Argentina 4-1 beatings for fun, has been reduced to trying to catch up. But between the 2021 Copa loss and the current disaster, there was one more moment, one more chance, one more attempt at redemption. And it came at the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. And this one hurts to talk about because for a brief, beautiful window of time, it actually looked like Brazil had figured out. Look at the numbers going into that tournament. Brazil, over 17 consecutive matches leading up to Qatar, had 14 wins and 3 draws. Not a single loss. They were tearing through South American qualifying. Neymar, now more mature, more disciplined, more measured in his behavior, was leading the attack. Around him was a stacked cast. Vinicius Jr., coming off a Champions League-winning season at Real Madrid. Rodrygo, quietly showing why he was Ancelotti's go-to man in big moments. Richarlison, in tremendous form at Tottenham. Casemiro, one of the best defensive midfielders in the world at that stage. Alisson in goal. Marquinhos and Thiago Silva at the back. Rafinha, Antony, Lucas Paqueta, Eder Militao. Real depth, real quality, real belief. And in the group stage, they looked terrifying. They beat Serbia 2-0. They beat Switzerland 1-0. They rested players against Cameroon in a controversial defeat, but they had already qualified. In the round of 16, they demolished South Korea 4-1 in what was, for many neutrals, the single most enjoyable performance of the entire tournament. Vinicius scored. Neymar scored a penalty. Richarlison scored. Paqueta scored. It was flowing, joyful, beautiful football. It looked, for the first time in years, like the Brazil people remembered. Cameras caught them dancing at the corner flag. Even the manager, tight, danced. And the entire footballing world thought, okay, this might be it. This might be the year. And then came Croatia. The quarterfinal against Croatia in Qatar 2022 is one of those matches that, for Brazilian fans, is going to sting for the rest of their lives. And it's going to sting more than most eliminations because Brazil actually played reasonably well. It wasn't a 7-1. It wasn't a case of being outclassed. It was worse in some ways. It was a match Brazil could have won, should have won, was winning, and then let slip through their fingers in the most devastating manner imaginable. For most of the game, it was a tight, technical affair. Croatia, with their veteran midfield of Luka Modric, Marcelo Brozovic, and Mateo Kovacic, controlled possession phases and forced Brazil into a more counterattacking rhythm. But Brazil created the better chances. Neymar, in particular, looked hungry, sharp, and willing to carry the team on his back. Vinicius was buzzing. Casemiro was doing his usual invisible but essential work in midfield. And after 90 minutes, the score was still 0-0. Off to extra time. And then, in the very first period of extra time, Neymar delivered a moment of pure magic. He picked the ball up in his own half, exchanged passes with Rodrygo and Paqueta in a lightning-quick sequence, danced past a Croatian defender, chipped it over to goalkeeper, and finished into the empty net. It was the kind of goal that felt like destiny. It was arguably the best goal of the tournament to that point. It equaled Pelé's all-time Brazil goal-scoring record at 77. And in that moment, in the stadium, in the commentary booths, in living rooms around the world, everybody assumed the same thing. Brazil was going through. It was over. Croatia had run out of magic. Neymar had delivered the moment his career had been building toward. Except Croatia hadn't run out of magic. And in the very final minutes of extra time, with Brazil sitting deeper than they should have, defending their lead nervously, Croatia broke forward. A long ball, a miscontrol, a recycled possession, and then Bruno Petkovic, a substitute, drilled a deflected shot past Alisson to make it 1-1. The Brazilian bench visibly deflated. The players on the pitch looked at each other in disbelief. And you could tell right then, before the whistle even blew for full time, that this game was going to penalties and that Brazil was going to lose those penalties. Because that's how these things go when the belief cracks. And that's exactly what happened. Rodrygo's penalty was saved. Marquinhos hit the post. Croatia converted their kicks calmly. And Brazil was out. Again. In the quarterfinals. Again. And the images that came out of that stadium after the final whistle are still hard to look at. Neymar sitting on the grass, unable to get up, sobbing openly. Teammates trying to console him, but visibly not knowing what to say. A young Croatian fan, in a beautiful moment of humanity, actually walking over to hug him. Because everybody who was watching, whether they were a fan of Neymar or not, understood what had just happened. This was probably his last real shot at a World Cup. He'd played his heart out. He'd delivered the moment of magic. And his teammates and the system around him had failed to close the deal. That match wasn't just a loss. It was the emotional confirmation of something that Brazilian football had been trying not to admit for years. That the current generation, for all its individual quality, didn't have the collective wiring to win the big ones. They had talent. They had moments. They didn't have that ruthless, coordinated closing ability that used to define Brazilian sides. The generation of Cafu and Roberto Carlos would have parked the bus with authority after Neymar's goal. The generation of Ronaldo and Rivaldo would have found a second goal to kill the game. This generation, in that critical moment, just froze. And after that, everything got worse. Tite resigned, as he had said he would if Brazil lost. The Federation, the CBF, entered a state of near-total chaos. And that chaos, over the following 2 years, was going to do more damage to Brazilian football than any single match ever could. Because when the institution running your football rots, no amount of individual talent on the pitch is going to save you. And Brazil was about to find that out the hard way. After Qatar 2022, Brazilian football entered a period that historians are eventually going to look back on as one of the most self-inflicted disasters in the history of the sport. Because while other footballing nations use post-World Cup periods to rebuild carefully, invest in youth structures, and hire long-term coaches, Brazil did essentially the opposite. They spent the next 2 years cycling through managers, dealing with legal chaos at the top of the federation, and losing games they had no business losing. The CBF, the Brazilian Football Confederation, was hit with corruption scandals. Its president was removed by a court order. Harassment accusations surfaced. Internal power struggles played out publicly in the Brazilian press. And in the middle of all of that, the national team was trying to prepare for qualifying and friendlies without stable leadership. Ramon Menezes had a caretaker stint. Fernando Diniz was brought in on a strange dual-role deal where he continued coaching Fluminense at the same time as coaching Brazil. That arrangement was, in hindsight, exactly as disastrous as it sounds. And the results on the pitch reflected the chaos off the pitch. Brazil started losing friendlies to teams they had no business losing to. Morocco beat them in Tangier. Senegal beat them in Lisbon. These were not weak sides, to be fair, but they were also not sides that a functioning Brazilian national team should have been losing to in preparation matches. And then the actual World Cup qualifier started, and things got substantially worse. For those who don't follow South American qualifying closely, here's the setup. 10 teams, round robin, home and away. Top 6 qualify automatically for the 2026 World Cup. 7th place goes to a playoff. Brazil, historically, has never in its entire history failed to qualify for a World Cup. Never. Not once. Even in their worst eras, they've always sailed through South American qualifying like it was a formality. Because that's the baseline. That's what being Brazil means. And then, in this current qualifying campaign, Brazil lost 3 consecutive matches. Uruguay beat them 2-0. Colombia held them to a draw at home. Then Brazil lost to Argentina 1-0 at the Maracana in an ugly, tense match. Then they lost at home to Argentina again in a separate match. Losses like that used to be unthinkable. Losing at home in a World Cup qualifier used to be a fireable offense for a Brazilian coach within 24 hours. But by 2024, it had become disturbingly routine. Dorival Jr., a well-respected Brazilian club coach, was brought in as the latest attempt to stabilize things. And for a brief moment, there was hope. He got a young, exciting squad. He tried to build around Vinicius, Rodrigo, and the new generation. He seemed to understand the modern game better than his predecessors. But even under Dorival, the 2024 Copa America in the United States was a disappointment. For matches, 1 win, 2 draws, and a quarterfinal elimination to Uruguay on penalties in which Vinicius was suspended for the match. Brazil couldn't get past Uruguay. Uruguay, a country with a fifth of Brazil's population and roughly 1% of its footballing infrastructure. And now, sitting in the current South American qualifying table, Brazil is in a position that no Brazilian fan would have ever believed possible 10 years ago. They are hovering around 5th place, a single point above Bolivia. If the current form continues, and it very well might, Brazil is looking at potentially the biggest World Cup qualifying shock of the 21st century. Not disqualification, not yet, but genuine real-world, on-the-table risk of needing an intercontinental playoff to reach a World Cup. And even that is a scenario that used to be reserved for teams like Bolivia and Venezuela, not the five-time champions. The federation, meanwhile, tried to pull off what would have been a masterstroke. They approached Carlo Ancelotti. Yes, that Ancelotti. The most decorated club manager of the modern era. The man who has won 5 Champions Leagues. And for a long time, it genuinely looked like it was going to happen. Ancelotti had verbally agreed to take the Brazil job after his time at Real Madrid was up. It was going to be a symbolic reset. A world-class European tactician coming in to give Brazil the tactical modernization the country had been resisting for a decade. Except then Real Madrid extended him. Ancelotti chose to stay in Madrid, and the Brazil job, once again, was left without its supposed savior. Which brings us to the present day. And now we have to talk about the actual structural, deep reasons why Brazil isn't scary anymore. Because everything we've talked about so far has been symptoms. The losses, the federation chaos, the failed managers. Those are the visible signs of decline. But the real disease sits underneath all of it. And it has been metastasizing for over 15 years, largely unnoticed by fans and completely unaddressed by the people in charge. Let's get into the actual causes. Because it's easy to blame Neymar. It's easy to blame the coaches. It's easy to blame the federation. And all of those have merit. But if we're being honest, the decline of Brazilian football is a structural collapse, not a personnel problem. And once you understand the structural issues, the current results actually make a lot of sense. The first, and probably most damaging, factor is the almost complete loss of playmaking identity in the midfield. For decades, Brazil produced technical, creative midfielders who could dictate tempo, unlock defenses, and glue attack to defense with vertical intelligence. Socrates, Zico, Rivaldo, Ronaldinho, Kaká. Even into the 2010s you had guys like Coutinho and, briefly, Lucas Paqueta. Now think about the current Brazil midfield. Who's the creative brain? Who's the guy that opposing teams have to game plan around in the middle third? There isn't one. There genuinely isn't a Brazilian midfielder in the current squad who would start for any of the top 5 European clubs in a creative role. Case Moreau is at Manchester United, defensive. Bruno Guimaraes at Newcastle, box-to-box. Rodrigo has been tried, but he's a natural forward. The creative midfielder position, historically the beating heart of Brazilian football, has essentially evaporated. And without that position filled at world-class level, the entire attacking philosophy falls apart. Second issue, the samba play style, that culturally specific way of dribbling, feinting, and improvising in tight spaces, has been diluted almost out of existence. Neymar was really the last player who embodied it consistently at the elite level. Vinicius has flashes of it, but his game is much more about vertical speed and left-foot cuts than actual samba creativity. Rodrigo is more of a positional finisher than a street dribbler. And the pipeline behind them isn't producing genuine successors. Which raises a deeper question. Why isn't Brazil producing samba players anymore? And the honest answer is that most talented Brazilian kids get shipped to European academies before they're 18. Which means they spend their formative years being trained in European positional systems, not Brazilian street culture. So by the time they reach the national team, they've already been reprogrammed. The identity is being trained out of them before they can even represent their country. Third structural issue. Brazil has almost completely stopped producing world-class defenders. Historically, Brazil was blessed with generational defensive talent. Cafu, Roberto Carlos, Lucio, Alder, Thiago Silva. Now name a Brazilian defender under 25 who would start at a top 4 Premier League club or a top 3 La Liga club. It's hard. Eder Militao is there but has struggled with injuries. Marquinhos is 30. Thiago Silva is 40. The pipeline is empty. And it's empty because the Brazilian domestic league has for years prioritized attacking football over defensive discipline in youth development. When you don't teach defending, you don't produce defenders. And when you don't produce defenders, no matter how many attackers you have, you can't win big tournaments. Because tournament football is won by defenders as much as by strikers. Fourth, Brazil has never really produced world-class coaches. Think about it. Name a Brazilian manager who has won the Champions League. There's exactly one, Vanderlei Luxemburgo, and that was in the 90s in a completely different form of the competition. Name a Brazilian who's managed a top 5 European club in the last decade. There's essentially nobody. Tite was respected domestically, but couldn't get a job at a major European side. Fernando Diniz is admired for his ideas, but has never left Brazil. The coaching culture in Brazil has stagnated. And when the coaching culture stagnates, the tactical evolution of the country stagnates with it. That's why Brazil has been so slow to adopt modern high-pressing, positional, data-driven football. The people teaching the game inside Brazil are largely still teaching a version of it from 20 years ago. Fifth, and this one is subtle but massive: cohesion, chemistry, team identity. Because so many Brazilian players now grow up in European club academies from a young age, they arrive at the national team with completely different footballing dialects. You have a player raised in La Masia thinking in positional geometry, next to a player raised in Manchester City thinking in high-press cycles, next to a player raised in a Portuguese club thinking in counterattacking transitions. They're all Brazilian by passport, but they don't share the same footballing language anymore. The old Brazilian teams had it because they all grew up in the same domestic league, watched the same TV coverage, played against each other in Brasileiro for years before ever putting on the yellow shirt. That shared foundation is gone, and you can see it in the way the current Brazil team plays. Disconnected, individualistic, beautiful moments strung together without a collective thread. Put all of those together. No creative midfielder, no samba identity, no world-class defenders, no coaching culture, no shared footballing dialect. And what you're left with is a national team that has flashes of individual brilliance surrounded by structural rot. That's not a slump. That's a system failure. So where does this leave us? Let's be honest with each other. Brazilian football is not dead. Brazil still produces more raw individual talent per capita than almost any country on earth. Endrick is at Real Madrid at 18 years old and already scoring important goals. Estevao has signed for Chelsea after being called one of the most exciting attacking prospects on the planet. Vinicius Jr. is, at his peak, one of the 3 or 4 best attacking players in the world. Rodrigo is a big-game specialist at Real Madrid. Alisson is arguably the best goalkeeper in the world. The raw material is still there. The pipeline hasn't collapsed. What has collapsed is everything around the pipeline. The management, the identity, the tactical culture, the federation, the domestic league, the coach development, the chemistry building infrastructure. All of it rotting quietly while the country stared at its 5 stars and assumed those stars alone would keep things going. But stars don't win games. Systems win games. And Brazil currently doesn't have a system. It has a collection of players, each individually excellent in their own club environment, arriving at the national team with no shared philosophy, no consistent tactical framework, no coach they can trust for the long haul, and no institutional support behind them. That is not a formula for winning the 2026 World Cup. It's a formula for another quarterfinal exit, or worse, for the unthinkable scenario of Brazil actually needing an intercontinental playoff just to be there. And the scariest part, the part that Brazilian fans are still struggling to sit with, is that this decline is not cyclical. It's not the kind of slump that a single tournament win can reverse. Because the structural causes we walked through in the last block are not going to fix themselves in a 2-year window. Rebuilding a coaching culture takes a generation. Reconstructing a domestic league identity takes at least 10 years. Producing a new wave of world-class defenders requires overhauling how youth academies teach the game. And convincing Brazilian teenage prodigies to stay in Brazil long enough to develop their samba identity before flying to Europe requires financial changes at the club level that nobody is currently making. None of these are quick fixes. None of them will be solved by hiring the next big-name coach. They are, all of them, decade-long projects that require political will, financial investment, and cultural humility. And Brazilian football is currently short on all 3. Which brings us back to where we started. The fear factor. The reason opponents used to shiver at the sight of the yellow shirt. That fear was earned by decades of consistent, systemic dominance across every level of the sport, from street football to youth academies, to domestic leagues, to national team results. That entire ecosystem, top to bottom, functioned in support of the national team. And when that ecosystem stopped functioning, the fear factor didn't disappear overnight. It faded slowly, match by match, loss by loss, embarrassment by embarrassment, until you get to the point we're at right now, where the current Brazil team walks onto the pitch and defenders around the world genuinely don't think about them the way they used to. Some of them, honestly, don't think about them at all. And that's the real proof of the decline. Not the results, the vibes, the energy in the room, the absence of that old dread. Now, will Brazil come back? Historically, empires that fall do sometimes rise again. Italy went through a decade of embarrassment and produced a Euro 2020 winning side. Germany rebuilt after a low point in the early 2000s and became world champions by 2014. Spain reinvented themselves after decades of underachievement and dominated an entire era. So it's not impossible. But it requires exactly the kind of structural reform that Brazilian football has, so far, refused to seriously commit to. Until that changes, we're going to keep watching the ghost of a giant walk onto pitches, wearing the yellow shirt, carrying the weight of a legend that the current squad can no longer live up to. Now, I want to hear from you, because this is the kind of debate that only really works when the fans get involved. First question, and be honest. Do you actually believe Brazil will qualify for the 2026 World Cup, or do you think we're witnessing the beginning of a historic collapse in real time? Second, if you had to pick one single fix, one structural reform that Brazilian football could make right now to start turning things around, what would it be? A new coach? A domestic league reform? Forcing top prospects to stay in Brazil longer? Drop your take in the comments and be specific, because vague answers don't move the debate forward. And third, controversial one. Do you think this Brazil generation with Vinicius and Rodrigo and Endrick actually has the ceiling to win a World Cup, or are they permanently doomed by the system around them? Let me know below. If you made it this far, you're the kind of football fan this channel is built for. Smash that like button. It genuinely helps the video get pushed to more people who care about the actual state of sport. Hit subscribe if you're not already, because the next couple of years in Brazilian football are going to be wild, and this channel is going to break down every single development as it happens. Ring the bell so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you in the next video.